In this video, we're going to take a look at Plessy versus Ferguson and see how the African Americans were able to overcome the massive impact that Plessy versus Ferguson had on equality in this country. And the first thing that we need to realize is that with Plessy versus Ferguson creating this de jure segregation, the African Americans could not turn to the government and ask the government to stop people from discriminating against them, because Plessy versus Ferguson basically said the government is allowed to do that. So what happens is in 1909 we had the creation of one of the first civil rights organizations in the country, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And this organization is created primarily to address the issue of de jure segregation, and the only way to really eliminate de jure discrimination is to do something about Plessy versus Ferguson. And this is the group that would become most closely aligned and associated with the African American Civil Rights Movement. When we look at the NAACP, there are lots of African Americans that come through the NAACP. They get very involved in the civil rights battle, and probably the one that's most famous and most recognizable to us would be Thurgood Marshall, the first African American on the U.S. Supreme Court. He was an attorney for the NAACP, and it would be Thurgood Marshall who would really attack this precedent of separate but equal by attacking what the Supreme Court said in the Plessy versus Ferguson argument. And we need to take a look at the fact that the NAACP had three basic options. There were three things they could have done, or three ways they could have attempted to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. First of all, they could have gone to individual state legislatures. They could have gone to Mississippi and Alabama and California and Utah and New York and South Carolina and all of those, and they could have tried to convince those state legislatures to change the law so that separate was not equal. Their second option is they could have gone to Congress and asked Congress to pass laws making this separate but equal doctrine illegal in the country. They could have asked Congress to start a constitutional amendment to outlaw separate but equal. So they could have gone to Congress. Or the third thing they could have done is they could have gone to the courts, primarily to the U.S. Supreme Court, and asked the U.S. Supreme Court to declare the separate but equal doctrine unconstitutional. And let's look at each one of these. Let's take a look at the first two together. African Americans could have gone to state legislatures, but you got to realize they would have had to convince, almost 5,000 or 6,000 people. Right now we have 7,300 legislators in this country. Back in the 1950s, I'm sure there were still, 3,000 or 4,000. So if the NAACP was going to try and overturn Plessy versus Ferguson by going through the state legislatures, they would have had to convince a majority of the legislators that Plessy versus Ferguson was wrong. If they were going to try and convince Congress to overturn or to change the Plessy versus Ferguson situation, they would have had to convince at least half of 535. Half of the 435 members of the House and half of the 100 members of the Senate. That would have taken a lot of work, and it would have taken a lot of organization, and it would have taken a lot of African Americans out there voting for these legislators. And the problem is that in the 1950s, African Americans had very little electoral strength. And what we mean by electoral strength is they had the right to vote, but they did not vote in very large numbers. If you're trying to convince an elected official to do something, you better be able to back up your request with some promised votes. For example, if I was to go to Joanne Emerson here in the 8th Congressional District and say, hey, Joanne Emerson, I'm the president of the NAACP here in the 8th Congressional District, and we think you should vote against this piece of legislation that's coming up. And if you don't vote against this piece of legislation coming up, Joanne Emerson, me and the other 7 members of the NAACP that vote are going to vote against you. Joanne Emerson is going to, basically be saying, well, 7 votes. 700,000 people in my district, 7 votes, I'm not really worried about it. But if I walk in and I say, Joanne Emerson, I'm in charge of the NAACP in your district, and we have, 100,000 members that vote, she's going to listen a little bit closer to that. And in the 1950s, there just was not a large number of African Americans that voted. So it was very difficult for them to use either the option of going through the state legislatures or going through Congress. They just didn't have the voting strength. So what they choose to do is they choose to go through the courts. They say, we're going to go through the courts. After all, there's only 9 men on the Supreme Court, and we only have to convince 5 of those 9 to change the Plessy versus Ferguson precedent. So they decide that they're going to use the courts to try and do this. This is not an option without some danger involved. If the NAACP goes to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1954 and tries to argue that separate but equal should be overturned, what happens if the Supreme Court says no, separate but equal is still okay? Then what happens is we no longer have this 58-year-old precedent that everybody can say is out of date. Now we have a brand new statement by the Supreme Court saying that racial segregation is okay. So this was quite a risk that the NAACP is taking. And in order to make sure that they had as good a chance as possible to be successful, they had to find just the right case. So basically between 1909 and 1954, they're trying to find the perfect case to take to the U.S. Supreme Court. And what happens is in 1954, the NAACP actually has several different cases working its way up to the Supreme Court dealing with racial segregation. And the Supreme Court decides to combine all of those cases into one case. And that case is known as Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP are going to argue this case before the Supreme Court, and basically what they're going to try and say is that racially segregated schools are unconstitutional. And the way that they're going to attempt to show that segregated schools are unconstitutional is they're going to attempt to show that segregated schools harm the minority students. And the Supreme Court has repeatedly said up to this point that if something is proven to be harmful, it cannot be constitutional. So the NAACP attempts to show that racially segregated schools harm the students. I want you to watch this short video now that's going to show you how the NAACP attempted to show that segregated schools harmed minority students.
The Unknown Chronicles of African Americans. These are the unrevealed stories of certain African Americans that have helped change the world. Come with us on this journey as we display a few successes of those who have attributed to bringing the human race from yes we can to yes we have.
Kenneth Bancroft Clark, born 1914, and Mamie Phipps Clark, born 1917, were African-American psychologists who, as a married team, conducted important research among children and were active in the civil rights movement. They were known for their 1940s experiments using dolls to study children's attitudes about race. They found that black children often preferred to play with white dolls over black. When asked to fill in a human figure with the color of their own skin, they frequently chose a lighter shade than what was accurate. Additionally, the children gave the color white attributes such as good and pretty, but black was qualified as bad and ugly. They viewed the results as evidence that the children had internalized racism caused by being discriminated against and stigmatized by segregation. The Clark's work contributed to the ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court in the Brown versus Board of Education case of 1954. This case determined that de jure racial segregation in public education was unconstitutional.